Hello.
I woke up to the sound of movement in my bedroom. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind snapped awake. This wasn't the usual creaking of the house settling or the distant hum of a passing car. This was something much closer. I wasn't dreaming. The dim light from the street lamp outside barely filtered through the curtains, casting soft, shifting shadows across the room as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. Then I saw it. A silhouette by the door.
Tall. Familiar.
My brother. He stood there, motionless, one hand resting on the doorframe as if frozen mid-step. For a moment, I wondered if he was sleepwalking, lost in some dream. But there was something about his stance, rigid, hesitant, that made me question that. My heart began to race even faster as I sat up, trying to figure out why he was in my room in the middle of the night. "Hey," I whispered, my voice shaky, barely louder than my own breath. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer. His face was mostly hidden in shadow, but I could see the tension in his jaw and the way his shoulders were unnaturally stiff. Something felt wrong, like the air between us was charged, taut like a rubber band, about to snap at any second. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but the words came out uneven, betraying my anxiety. Still, he didn't say anything. Just as I was about to ask again, he moved forward slowly, deliberately. Each step seemed measured, like he was testing the ground beneath him. He didn't speak, but his presence filled the room with a suffocating silence. I wanted to reach out, to shake him out of whatever trance he was in, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped by a strange mix of confusion and fear. Without warning, he was standing right beside my bed. Too close. My breath caught, and I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep eye contact. But his gaze was distant, as though he wasn't really seeing me, like he was looking right through me, seeing something that wasn't there. And then he leaned in. I couldn't make sense of what was happening. One moment we were locked in this tense, silent standoff, and the next, I felt his lips brush against mine. It was a fleeting, trembling touch, so sudden and out of place that I couldn't react. I froze, my mind racing to process what had just occurred. What the hell was that? He pulled away just as quickly, stepping back into the shadows with a look on his face I couldn't interpret. It wasn't relief or regret. It was something deeper, more complicated. Something I didn't have the words for.
I'm
sorry, he muttered under his breath, almost too quietly to hear. I blinked, still trying to catch up, my mind struggling to make sense of it. My brother was apologizing? For what? For being in my room? For the kiss? For everything that had just happened in those few surreal moments? "What are you doing?" I repeated, louder now, my voice harsher, though I wasn't sure who I was angry at, him or myself. "Why are you?" But he was already backing out of the room, shaking his head, retreating as though he was desperate to put distance between us. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone in the dark once more. For a long minute, I just sat there, my mind spinning through 1,000 thoughts, none of which made any sense. The whole thing felt unreal, like I had stepped into some alternate reality where nothing made sense anymore. But it was real. I could still feel the warmth of his breath lingering in the air, the faint pressure of his lips on mine. The room was cold now, colder than it should have been, but my skin still burned with the memory of that strange, confusing contact. It wasn't just the kiss that unsettled me. It was the way he had looked at me, like he was fighting something inside himself. He was wrestling with some unspoken battle. And then there was the silence, heavy, oppressive, that had settled over us as soon as I woke up. I slowly got out of bed, my legs shaky, unsure of what to do next. My mind screamed for answers, but none came. I glanced at the clock. 3:27 a.m. It was too early for rational explanations. It was too late to pretend this was just some bizarre dream. I thought about going after him, demanding an explanation, but something stopped me. It wasn't fear, at least not entirely. It was more like hesitation, as if part of me knew that whatever was going on with him was something I wasn't ready to confront, something I wasn't prepared to hear. Instead, I sank back into bed, pulling the covers tightly around me as though they could shield me from the strangeness of the night. My heart was still pounding, my thoughts scattered in every direction, but none of them brought me any closer to understanding. The silence in the house had returned, but now it felt different. Tense. Fragile. As if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something else to break. I couldn't help but wonder what he was thinking.
Why now?
And, most importantly, what happens next? The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of what had happened. It clung to me like a shadow, impossible to ignore. Every time I tried to focus on something else, making coffee, folding laundry, even brushing my teeth, my mind snapped back to that night. To him standing there in the dark. To that kiss. Brief, but unforgettable. I heard him moving around the house, and my stomach tightened. I wasn't ready to face him. Not yet. What could I even say? What could I say? Maybe he'd pretend it never happened. Maybe he was just as confused as I was. Or maybe, worst of all, he had done it on purpose and was waiting for me to bring it up. I stayed in my room longer than usual, pacing in small circles, hoping somehow that would help me figure out what to do. But nothing came. Every time I thought about going downstairs, my chest tightened and my heart started to race. Eventually, the silence told me he had left the house. I exhaled, relieved, but also disappointed. I couldn't make sense of my own feelings. When I finally made my way downstairs, the house felt unnervingly quiet. I half expected to find a note, some explanation that would make sense of it all. But there was nothing. Just the lingering scent of his cologne and the faint warmth in the kitchen where he had made his breakfast and gone. I woke to the sound of movement in my bedroom, and instantly, my heart was pounding. My mind snapped awake, no longer clouded by sleep. This wasn't the usual creaks of the house settling, or a car passing by. This felt far too close. I wasn't imagining it. The faint glow from the streetlight outside barely peeked through the curtains, casting shifting shadows across the room as my eyes tried to adjust to the darkness. And then I saw it. A figure by the door.
Tall. Familiar.
My brother. He stood there unmoving, his hand resting on the doorframe like he was caught mid-step. For a brief moment, I wondered if he was sleepwalking, trapped in some dream. But something in his posture, rigid, uncertain, made me second-guess that thought. My heart started to race even faster as I sat up, trying to figure out why he was in my room at this hour. "Hey," I whispered, my voice trembling, barely above a breath. "What's going on?" He didn't respond. His face was hidden mostly in shadow, but I could make out the tension in his jaw and how his shoulders were stiff, almost unnatural. There was something off about the air between us, like it was thick with unspoken tension, pulled tight, about to snap. "Are you okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, but the words came out shaky, betraying the unease rising in me. Still no answer. Just as I was about to speak again, he stepped forward, slow, deliberate. Each movement was cautious, like he was testing the ground beneath him. No words, just an eerie presence filling the room with a suffocating quiet. I wanted to reach out to grab him and shake him from whatever trance he was in, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, caught between confusion and fear. Then, suddenly, he was right beside my bed, standing too close. My breath caught, and I swallowed hard, forcing myself to keep my gaze locked with his. But his eyes were distant, like he wasn't really seeing me at all. It was like he was looking through me, seeing something that wasn't even there. Then, without warning, he leaned in. I couldn't understand what was happening. One moment, we were stuck in this silent, tense standoff, and the next, I felt his lips brush against mine. It was quick, shaky, and completely out of place, and I couldn't even react. I froze, my mind spinning, unable to process what had just happened. What the hell? He pulled back almost immediately, retreating into the shadows with an unreadable look on his face. It wasn't relief. It wasn't regret. It was something else, something deeper, something I couldn't put into words. I'm sorry, he murmured, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. I blinked, trying to catch up, my thoughts racing. My brother was apologizing? For what? For being in my room? For the kiss? For the mess of emotions we were both caught in during those few surreal moments? What the hell are you doing? I asked again, my voice louder now, more demanding, though I wasn't sure who I was angry with, him or myself. Why are you? But before I could finish, he started backing away, shaking his head, retreating like he was desperate to get away from me. The door clicked shut softly behind him, leaving me alone in the dark once more. For a long time, I stayed there, just sitting in the silence, my mind racing through 1,000 different thoughts, none of them making sense. The whole thing felt like a nightmare, like I had slipped into some strange version of reality where nothing fit together. But it was real. I could still feel the warmth of his breath in the air, the faint pressure of his lips on mine. The room was colder now, much colder than it should have been, but my skin still burned from that brief, strange contact. It wasn't just the kiss that disturbed me. It was the way he looked at me, like he was battling something inside, something I didn't understand. He was fighting some inner war. And then there was the silence, thick and heavy, that hung between us the moment I woke up. Slowly, I got out of bed, legs shaking, unsure of what to do next. My mind screamed for answers, but nothing came. I glanced at the clock. 3:27 a.m. too early to make sense of any of this. I couldn't pretend anymore that this was all some strange dream. I thought about going after him, demanding some kind of explanation, but something held me back. It wasn't fear, not entirely. It was more like hesitation, like I knew deep down that whatever was going on with him was something I wasn't ready to face, something I wasn't prepared to understand. Instead, I pulled the covers tightly around me, like they could shield me from the bizarre events of the night. My heart was still hammering, my thoughts scattered in all directions, but none of them helped me make sense of what had just happened. The silence in the house had returned, but now it felt different, tense, fragile. It was like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to break. I couldn't stop wondering what he was thinking.
Why now?
And most of all, what comes next? The following morning, the events of the night clung to me like a shadow, refusing to let go. Every time I tried to focus on something else, making coffee, doing laundry, even brushing my teeth, my mind kept flashing back to the night before. To him, standing in the dark. To that kiss. So brief, but impossible to forget. I heard him moving around the house, and my stomach twisted into knots. I wasn't ready to face him. Not yet. What could I even say? What would I say? Maybe he'd pretend it never happened. Maybe he was just as confused as I was. Or worse, maybe he had done it on purpose and was waiting for me to bring it up. I stayed in my room far longer than usual, pacing back and forth, hoping somehow it would help me figure out what to do. But nothing came. Every time I thought about going downstairs, my chest tightened and my heart began to race again. Eventually, the silence let me know that he had left. I exhaled, relieved, but also disappointed. I still couldn't understand my own feelings. When I finally made my way downstairs, the house felt eerily quiet. I half expected to find a note, anything that could explain what had happened. But there was nothing. Only the lingering scent of his cologne and the faint warmth in the kitchen, where he had made breakfast and left. It had been a mistake. That's what he'd said. He didn't understand why it happened, and I couldn't explain it either. But could that really be enough? Was I supposed to just chalk it up to some moment of confusion? Or was this the beginning of something much bigger? Something that would shift everything between us? The path led me to a small clearing where a fallen tree had created a kind of natural bench. I sat down, feeling the rough bark beneath me, and buried my face in my hands. The weight of everything pressed down, heavy and suffocating, as if the forest itself was closing in on me. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything that might release the pressure building in my chest. But nothing came. I pulled out my phone and stared at the blank screen for a long moment before unlocking it. No messages. No missed calls. A small part of me had expected him to reach out, but the silence felt louder than any words could have. Maybe he was giving me space. Or maybe he didn't know what to say. I wasn't sure which was worse. I opened the messaging app and started typing, my fingers moving faster than my thoughts could catch up with. I typed, "I don't know what to say." I stared at it for a second, then deleted it. What was I hoping he'd say in reply? What could he say to make any of this feel better? I started again, my fingers typing. Why did you do it again? But even before I finished, I deleted that too. The question had already been asked, and his answer had been vague, unsatisfying. I didn't need to hear it again. What I needed was something else, something I couldn't quite put into words. A gust of wind rushed through the trees, sending a chill down my spine. Frustrated, I slipped my phone back into my pocket. I wasn't ready to reach out, not yet. I leaned back against the fallen tree and closed my eyes, trying to focus on the sounds of the forest around me. This was supposed to help. Being out here, away from everything, had always given me clarity before. But now, even nature couldn't calm the storm brewing inside me. After what felt like hours, I stood and began walking back down the trail. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting long shadows across the path, and the air was cooler. I zipped up my jacket, wrapping my arms around myself as I walked, hoping the motion would warm me or at least distract me. But with each step, the weight of it all grew heavier. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't avoid him forever. We shared the same house, the same space. Eventually, I'd have to face him. But what then? Would we pretend it never happened? Could we go back to how things were? Or would the tension between us fester until it became too big to ignore? I reached the car and leaned against the hood, staring out at the trees swaying gently in the breeze. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. I pulled it out, half expecting to see his name. But it wasn't him. It was a message from a friend I hadn't heard from in a while, asking if I wanted to grab coffee sometime soon. The normalcy of it hit me like a shock. It felt strange, like the rest of the world was moving on while I was stuck in this uncomfortable, uncharted space. I didn't reply. Instead, I got in the car and started the engine, the hum of the vehicle filling the silence that had surrounded me all day. As I drove back toward the city, my thoughts continued to spiral, looping around the same questions. What happens next? By the time I got home, the sun was setting, casting warm golden light through the windows. The house felt eerily quiet, and I knew he was there somewhere, waiting. The tension from earlier still hung thick in the air, oppressive. I wanted to avoid it, to retreat to my room and pretend none of this was happening, but I knew that wouldn't help. We couldn't keep dodging each other. I found him in the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He didn't look up when I entered, but I could feel the shift in the air as he sensed my presence. "Hey," I said, my voice steady but soft. He finally lifted his gaze, and there was an exhaustion in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. Maybe we were both worn down by the weight of everything left unsaid. "I've been thinking," I began, moving toward the window. I could see the reflection of his face in the glass, the way he watched me, waiting for me to continue. "Do you remember when we used to go riding, back when we were kids?" A faint smile crossed his face, and for a moment, the tension between us seemed to ease. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You used to love it. We'd spend hours at the stables." I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. "I miss that," I admitted. "I miss how simple things used to be. Just you, me, and the horses. No worries. No complications." He glanced away, his fingers tapping restlessly on his knee. "It was easier back then," he said, his voice distant, like he wasn't really with me anymore. The silence stretched between us, and I took a breath before saying what had been on my mind all day. "I was thinking maybe we could go riding again. Like we used to," I said, trailing off. I wasn't even sure why I was asking, but there was something inside me craving that old sense of normalcy, the comfort of being close to him in a way that didn't feel so complicated. He looked up at me, surprised. "You want to go riding? After everything?" I shrugged, trying to hide how much the idea meant to me.
Yeah, why not?
We used to have fun, right? I miss that. I miss us. For a moment, I thought he might say no, but then he nodded slowly, his expression softening. "All right, let's go riding." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the idea of returning to something familiar, something that made sense. Or maybe it was the hope that, for just a few hours, We could forget the confusion and be the siblings we once were. Tomorrow, we'd go riding again, just like before. Maybe for a little while, things could feel normal again. The next morning, we drove out to the stables in near silence. The tension from the past few days still hung between us. I kept sneaking glances at him, hoping for some sign that things might go back to normal. But his face remained unreadable, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The sun had just started rising, casting a soft, golden glow over the fields as we pulled up to the familiar barn. It felt like stepping into a different time, one where things had been simpler. It was like a version of our lives before everything got complicated. I'd always loved the smell of the stables, the earthy scent of hay and leather, the quiet snorts of horses in their stalls. As we walked inside, the flood of memories was immediate. This place had once been our sanctuary, a world that belonged only to us. Back then, it was always me who dragged him out here, eager to spend hours riding through the fields. He never complained. In his quiet way, I think he enjoyed it too. The stable hands greeted us with warm smiles, remembering us from all those years ago. It felt strange being back, almost like returning to a place that should have stayed locked away in the past. But at the same time, it was comforting.
Familiar.
Soon, we were saddled up and ready to go. The horses were calm beneath us, their steady breathing a welcome distraction from the knot of emotions I couldn't quite unravel. As we rode down the familiar trail, the sound of hooves crunching against the dirt was the only noise between us. At first, we said nothing. The silence stretched on. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet kind of peace, like we were both waiting, unsure of how to begin, or if we needed to. We reached the clearing, the one where we used to race as kids. That's when I finally found the courage to speak. "It's been a long time," I said, glancing over at him. He nodded, his expression softening.
Yeah.
I didn't realize how much I missed this. A smile tugged at my lips as I let the rhythm of the ride calm my nerves.
"It feels good," I said.
"Like things used to be." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew it wasn't entirely true. Things weren't the same as they had been. We weren't those carefree kids anymore. Whatever had shifted between us, it wasn't something that a ride through the countryside could undo. Still, for now, I wanted to hold on to the illusion of normalcy, even if just for a little while. We rode for another hour, talking in brief bursts, mostly about nothing important. The weather, the horses, memories from when we were young. And for the first time in days, it felt almost normal. Almost. Eventually, we stopped at the top of a small hill, overlooking the valley below. The view was breathtaking, rolling green fields dotted with trees, the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. We dismounted, letting the horses graze nearby while we sat on the grass side by side, but not touching. The air between us was heavy with the things we hadn't said, but neither of us seemed ready to voice them. After a long pause, he broke the silence. "I don't want things to be like this," he said quietly, his eyes locked on the horizon. "I don't know what happened, but I hate how distant we've become." I looked down at my hands, feeling the familiar ache return to my chest. "Me too," I admitted. "But I don't know how to fix it." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe it's not something we can fix. Maybe it's just how things are now." I swallowed hard, unwilling to believe that, unwilling to accept that the closeness we had shared might be gone for good. But deep down, I knew he was right. Something fundamental had shifted between us, and no amount of riding through the fields was going to change that. We sat there for what felt like ages, watching the sun climb higher into the sky, neither of us knowing what to say. The silence between us felt heavier than ever. The horses grazed lazily nearby, their rhythmic chewing the only sound that broke the stillness. I could feel the weight of his words. There was finality in them. Maybe this was just how things were now. But I wasn't ready to accept that. I wasn't ready to lose what we had shared, even if it was slipping away. "I wish things could go back to how they were," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I wasn't even sure if I was talking to him, or just thinking aloud. Back when everything was simpler, he didn't respond. I didn't dare look at him, instead keeping my eyes on the horizon, on the distant hills that felt impossibly far away, like another world entirely. The sun was high in the sky now, casting long shadows across the grass. For a brief moment, I let myself believe that we were just two people sitting in the sun, that nothing had changed.
But I knew that was a lie.
I felt him shift next to me, his body tense, like he was about to say something important. I held my breath, waiting, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. "I miss it too," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "But I think we're different people now. You and me. We can't go back, even if we wanted to." I bit my lip, fighting back the lump that had risen in my throat. I knew he was right, of course he was. But hearing it out loud didn't make it any easier. "Do you regret it?" I asked before I could stop myself. My heart pounded as the question hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. For a moment, he didn't answer. I could feel my pulse racing, my skin tingling with anticipation. Finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of everything had fallen on them. "I don't know," he admitted. "Sometimes, I think I do. But other times, no. Maybe this was bound to happen." The words hit me harder than I expected. Bound to happen. Was this really inevitable? Had we been on this path all along without even realizing it? I turned to face him, searching his eyes for some kind of explanation, some hint that he was as lost as I was. But when I looked into his eyes, I didn't see confusion. I didn't see regret. It was something else, something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. "Maybe it's better if we take a break," he said quietly, almost as if he was speaking to himself. "Maybe some space will help us figure things out." The words hit me like a heavy stone, sinking deep into my chest.
Space. A break.
It sounded so final, so cold. And yet, I couldn't argue with him. Maybe he was right. Maybe we both needed time to process everything that had happened. A little distance, some time apart, to help us see things more clearly. But as I sat there looking at him, I realized something else. Space wouldn't fix this. It wouldn't undo what had happened between us. What had changed us wasn't something that could be erased, no matter how much time or distance we put between us. That change would stay with us. Always. I stood up, brushing the grass from my jeans, and turned to face him. His eyes met mine, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw the boy I used to know, the one who had always been there for me, who I could always count on. But that boy was gone now, replaced by a man I no longer understood. "I think you're right," I said, my voice steady even though chaos roared inside me. "Maybe space is what we need." He nodded, but there was a sadness in his eyes, something that told me he wasn't as sure as he was pretending to be. "Yeah, maybe," he said, but it didn't sound convincing. We stood there for a moment, the space between us widening with each passing second of silence. The wind whispered through the trees, and the horses shifted uneasily in the field. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, without thinking, I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around him. It wasn't a long hug. It wasn't the kind that solved anything. It felt more like a goodbye, even though we hadn't said it out loud. I pulled away, the sting of unspoken tears welling up behind my eyes. Without a word, I turned and started walking back toward the stables. I couldn't look back. I just couldn't. As I walked, the sound of his footsteps faded behind me, and with every step, something inside me seemed to unravel. Maybe this was for the best. Maybe it was how things were meant to be. But as I reached the stable door, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, glancing down at the screen. A text from him. "I miss us already." I stared at the words, my heart twisting in my chest. I wanted to respond, to say something that would make it all better. But no words came. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked inside.
No.
Goodbye.